Good morning, hello, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Karibuni, welcome to Google Talks. I'm very excited to have everyone in today with us. Welcome to this Talks at Google virtual event. I am Mothonio Richards. I am on the privacy team here at Google. Before we get started, I want to remind the audience we will be taking questions towards the end of this talk. So as you think of questions throughout this conversation, please be sure to add them to the live chat on the right. I am very excited to introduce today's guest, Dipo Faloyin. Dipo has been is currently he is a senior editor and a writer at Vice, where his work has a specific focus on culture, race, and identity across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. His writing has also featured in Dazed, The Huffington Post, Refinery 29. He was born in Chicago, raised in Lagos, and currently lives in London. Dipo, welcome to the show.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today.
Thank you so much. And just as you and I were talking about before we came on live, this is very much a conversation, sort of like what you would encounter if you happened to be sitting in the back of the kitchen while mom and aunt and uncles and dad are sitting around talking politics. Like I always say, we say that the number one sport in Africa is politics. We're followed very closely by football. So I would like to start with an amazing statement that you make at the beginning of your book, which is Lagos is full. And then you proceed to talk about how the people of Lagos have a very distinctive way of carrying themselves. And you talk about it in the form of, you tell it as a joke. If it was a joke, it would be 21 million, Nigerians walk into a bar. And the bottom line is none of them are shy. They're all, they're very willing to express themselves. And what I like about that is how it shows the difference in the way we identify ourselves and the way we see ourselves. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, certainly. Well, Lagos is a place that is certainly unburdened by self-doubt, as I write in the book. And it's really important to me to start the book by taking readers to my family's hometown of Lagos. I want people not to see the continent as a place of predetermined destinies and where it's a monolith of identities. I want people to picture themselves there, to really see the specificities of Lagos and of a particular place. And so I take the reader to a place that I know incredibly well, which is my hometown of Lagos, so that they understand that within Africa, there are specific identities. The book is titled Africa is Not a Country because for too long, the Western world has treated Africa as if it is one big country. And so what I want to do is, straight off the bat, at the beginning of the book, I want to show people that there is true specificity of identity and experience. And for me, there's nowhere more unique and exciting as Lagos.
Fantastic. Yes, you so aptly depict the complexity of Africans as communities, peoples, individuals, and the way you paint your family and community with such texture that we get to see so much of ourselves, regardless of places of origin.
Yeah.
There's something else you say. It's an interesting statement. You say identities form specifically, and it hones in on how we develop our sense of self. How have portrayals of Africa in mainstream media influenced you and your identity?
I think the thing that has sort of impacted me personally is that I've wanted to kind of dedicate my work to trying to paint a fuller picture, the picture that isn't normally painted by the media and by popular culture. The book is fundamentally about two things. It's about identities and it's about context. Firstly, with identities, it's about the specificity of identities. Our identities are unique to us, our experiences, our histories, our families, where we're raised. That's something that is unique to each individual. But that uniqueness isn't something that's really valued when we talk about Africa and Africans. We think of them. Two images come to mind when we think of Africa: that of poverty and strife,
Yeah.
or safari, with
Mhm.
absolutely nothing in between. And that's where we get to context.
Yeah.
And this book is about the missing context when we talk about Africa. Context of history and context of present. And I think it's really, really important that people start to appreciate that and realize how much context is missing when we talk about the identity of Africans. And so, for me and many people across the region, you grew up struggling to express your identity to other people because they can't get the stereotypes that they've grown up with out of their minds. So, you know, putting my unique identity forward, getting people to really understand and appreciate who my own culture and where I'm from is an ongoing challenge because, the first thing you have to do is shift people's perceptions
Mhm.
of who you are because they often, when it comes to Africa, have formed specific ideas of their own based on the stereotypes that we've seen in the media and popular culture for as long as I've been alive, and for pretty much since the founding of many of these countries.
That's very true. And it strikes me that we spend, especially for those of us in the later diaspora, we spend a lot of energy and time trying to break down those stereotypes while at the same time trying to hold on to our home country. Because
Mhm.
one of the things that's unique for us as a recent diaspora is we have two countries. We have the home country and the host country. And in the home country, we are understood, we move very fluidly like water. But in the
Mhm.
host country, we have to keep checking ourselves. And depending on where you are, even when you actually began your diaspora experience, you find that you have to, you may have to explain yourself more or even less. But I'd like to explore something else with you, which is the way that we have begun to have a really strong pushback on perceptions of Africa. And the way you tell that story in your book is when you talk about Coney 2012
Yeah.
and the famous song of They Don't Know It's Christmas. Talk to us
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I mean, Coney 2012, this is the 10-year anniversary of a campaign that attempted to, as they put it, rid the world of Joseph Kony. Three American filmmakers traveled to Uganda. There they met a young boy called Joseph, who had been targeted by the Lord's Resistance Army, then headed by a man called Joseph Kony. Now, of course, Joseph had a really struggled with his childhood and even brutalized by the Lord's Resistance Army. And so these American filmmakers decided that, it was on them to do something about it. And so they created this film, Coney 2012, which depicted a Uganda that didn't really exist.
Mhm.
It showed the typical images that we're used to seeing when we talk about Africa, warlords in fatigues. And it painted a picture of just unbridled devastation and struggle and pain. And it left out a lot of really, really important facts. The most important of which was that Joseph Kony at the time wasn't even in Uganda, but they did it because a lot of that imagery is what charity and development agencies have used for, decades and decades to elicit quick fix donations, when it comes to
Absolutely.
Africa, without
Mhm.
really appreciating what the actual reality on the ground is. Many people in Uganda had worked incredibly hard for years and years, to defeat the Lord's Resistance Army, to push them back to the point where Joseph Kony had to flee the country, and there was only a few men who were still there to support him. But a lot of that was stripped out of the film, and there had been by that point a long tradition of these development agencies doing this, and one of the most successful campaigns that ever existed years before Coney 2012 was something called "Do They Know It's Christmas," which was a charity single by an organization called Band Aid, which is a song that's still sung continually every year in the UK during Christmas time, and it features some of the most offensive lyrics about
Yeah.
Africa ever written. It talks about how no rivers flow, no waters flow. The only thing that flows in the continent is tears. It talks about how most Africans, all that the best that they can hope for at Christmas time is to stay alive and not feel any joy or happiness in this place. And these stereotypes and depictions have harmed the region ever since they were brought onto the fore. If you look at Uganda, for example, up until Kony 2012, Uganda had enjoyed year after year of a positive rise in tourism into the country. In fact, 2012 was the year that Time Out magazine had picked Uganda as the #1 tourist destination in the world. But after Kony 2012's video went out, tourism completely nosedived in the country, and they really, really struggled to recover from that. That's a real loss in
It is.
status, in revenue, all because of an inaccurate charity film. And so, we talk about it in the context of, the way in which the continent is constantly depicted, but as well as when it comes to kind of what we call the
Mm-hmm.
white saviors, which is the need for the West to paint themselves as the great saviors of Africa. And none of this is to say that there aren't challenges that exist on the continent,
Mm-hmm.
but it's to say that when we understand fully the story and the context and the history behind many of these challenges, then then we are in a far better position to make any positive changes, hopefully led by people on the ground.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. It reminded me of a song that I have loved for a very long time, and now I'm starting to question my love for it because I understand where it comes from, and that's the song "We Are the World."
Yeah,
I mean, from the very beginning of the sound, when the strings start, literally, and the horns, I know that song. I know that
yeah,
sound, and it came into my consciousness when I was pretty young. Way back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I remember one day the documentary stumbled across our screen. This was when I was in Nairobi. And I was glued to the screen. I was supposed to be asleep. I was supposed to be in bed, but here I was watching TV and giving my dad a sidelong glance, like trying to think, is he going to tell me to go to bed or not? But I really wanted to see this documentary. And what I remember about it so distinctly is the way the musicians carried themselves into the room and the way they sang with such great belief. I even remember Cyndi Lauper being asked to take off her jewelry because it was making noise whenever she moved her hands in the recording studio. And the way you describe it in the book, I'm thinking, oh my goodness. Here I was in love with a song that maybe I should think twice about. And it's interesting to me how those kinds of portrayals have actually resulted in a long-term hold on the memory, global memory of Africa, because to this day, people still remember the pictures and the images of the child who is bent over while a vulture stands right next to the child,
yeah.
waiting for the child to die. um, help me unpack that a little bit, because it sounded to me like what you were saying is, yeah, it's a great song, but then the impact has been significantly more negative, and the creator of that movement, USA for Africa, has sort of taken a different take on why he even does what he does.
Yeah, I mean, and We Are the World's a good example. It had a far more diverse creative force behind it. So, the lyrics on the surface, are nowhere near as offensive as, Do They Know It's Christmas? It's more of a generic song of let's all just hold hands and make the world a better place sort of vibe. But the challenge is that, with these quick fix donations,
Yeah.
we don't really think about the long term future of these countries. We don't think about the damage that comes from constantly projecting negative images of Africa. Very rarely when we talk about the challenges facing certain African countries, we never put to the front, the people from those countries who are doing incredible work building up their nations. One thing I try and remind people is that these are very young countries. Nigeria, where my family are from, Nigeria is a country that's younger than my parents. And many of these countries have done a huge amount of work since the independence era of the 1960s to really set a path for the future of their nations, to build a strong identity, and none of that is rarely appreciated through these charity signals. What these uh, agencies have traditionally wanted to do is get people emotionally moved by these videos so that they make donations suddenly, rather than actually engaging with these countries in real and impactful ways. When you think about many African countries, you think, oh, how can I send them money? How can I send
Yeah.
them aid? Rather than, oh, maybe it'd be great for me and my family to live there, or for me to start a business there, or for me to go on holiday there. Those are the long-term developments that would be far more beneficial to these countries, than sending, £1 or $1, once every 10 years, but actually to imagine yourself in these countries. And that's what this book tries to do. It tries to build a human connection with the continent, and with specific countries, and with the history and the present of the region. And that's the thing, I want people to feel like they can imagine themselves there, like they can imagine their families there, like the people who live there experience the same things that you might experience in San Francisco or in London or Madrid or anywhere else in the world.
Very true. When I was reading your book, it sounded to me very much like it was a love letter, to us as a continent, and to the rest of your family, to say, all these years I saw you, I understood you, and even to yourself to say, I'm proud to be African and Nigerian at that, and these are the things that I understand about myself. So with that said, let's dig a little bit deeper into the background. I tried to save the emotionally challenging questions for a little later on in the talk. But let's talk a bit about the truths of colonialism, the truths of why we are where we are today in Africa. Today is Africa Day. This is the day that the Organization of African Unity was formed, and this is why we commemorate today. But it came out of a place where we'd already lived through, in different countries, significant fights when it came to getting independence. And to this day, there's still a sense of trauma on the continent, depending on where you are, about the price that had to be paid for us to become who we are. Walk us through that journey, what you found out, and perhaps as you do so, if you could drop a little crumb on what was most shocking in your discovery process.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to understand modern Africa without understanding colonialism, and how these individual countries were formed. The most important thing to remember is that these are artificial nations. These are countries that were entirely designed and made up by colonialists, purely so that they can extract as much of the natural resources from the continent as possible. The shape of modern Africa, or the journey of modern Africa, began in 1884 at the Berlin Conference, when the great colonial nations of the time met to hash out rules for the carving up of Africa. They'd all agreed that it was within their right to invade and to take from Africa whatever it wanted. They didn't care about the lives of the communities, of the people, the writers, the poets, the artisans who had been living in this region for the beginning of time. But what happened at the time was that they felt like they could just come in and completely redesign the makeup of the region. That's exactly what they did.
Yeah.
They turned up with, I explain it as, with very loose maps and even looser morals, and carved up the region. Many of them had never been there before, which is why when you look at a map of Africa, about 30% of all borders are just straight lines, which split apart 10% of all ethnic groups. And it created these incredibly unstable countries that were filled with, dozens of different ethnic groups who spoke different languages, who worshipped different gods. And at a point, the colonialists, especially the British, realized that if they pitted these ethnic groups against each other, then these countries would struggle to find a national identity, and therefore the ethnic groups would not work together to fight for independence. So that was one of the reasons why the independence movement was put off for so long, because the British especially implemented a policy of divide and rule. And so that is kind of the birth of these countries, and understanding that it was an incredibly traumatic birth. It involved huge struggle to gain independence and to fight for their freedoms. One example that I have is, and probably as you mentioned, kind of the most shocking for me, was the birth of a country in Central Africa. It was the first country to be created after the Berlin Conference. It was created by King Leopold of Belgium, who had felt like his job as king did not come with enough responsibilities. He was essentially bored. And so the Berlin Conference gave him an area of Central Africa that was about over 10 times the size of Belgium. And so quite quickly into his reign of this area, he realized that it was incredibly expensive to run a country. And so he put the previously free people of this Central African region to work as slaves, to feed the growing tire industry and to extract rubber, and to push them to extract at maximum value. He created this incredibly brutal regime of slavery. And by the end of his short reign over this region, about half the population, 10 million people, had been murdered by him, and by this regime. And that was the birth of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And to understand that, so many of these countries face such difficult beginnings, and to understand that they were not created to be harmonious, successful nations, but instead they were created essentially to be unstable things and to fail. And when you understand that context and that backdrop, and then you get to 1960, where these nations successfully start to fight for their independence, and they start to try their best to work together to build strong nations with strong identities, while the rest of the world was, making huge advances in science and technology. You start to see how, so many great nations that we know today are from the region, and they've made huge impacts culturally in such a short period of time, despite the births of their nations. You start to see the story of Africa not one as a sad story, but one of actual triumph by so many Africans and African countries, despite their beginnings, to build really strong futures.
That's very impactful, because, like you say in the book, we have 30% of the world borders, but we have 60% of disputes at the ICJ when it comes to the borders and boundaries question. And it definitely raises for us the question of how do we then proceed? And one of the things that you unearth is how to see ourselves also in the initial political formation. This is when you discuss the seven democracies. Referring a little bit further back in our history as Africans, where we very clearly have been peoples of democracy. And so it's not that this was a new concept for us. We already were living these lives. And you paint it so beautifully when you say it is different when a decision has to be made by your next door neighbor, which is what typically happens in a democratic society, because then that person has to include you. Talk to us about what you came across of the things that you portrayed in the book, specifically in regard to that question of how democracy has played out.
Yeah, so I mean, one favorite tactic of the colonialists, was to, in sort of regions of the continent where they themselves did not want to live, because of the climate and malaria, they would empower local, often corrupt men, people who were slipped to a bribe, often military men who had been trained abroad. They found essentially the worst amongst us, to forcibly rule over these large nations that they had created out of thin air. And they built these capital cities that were often thousands and thousands of miles away from, small communities that had created within themselves, well-functioning democracies. But suddenly you're told that you're now part of this wider nation
Yeah.
where, the strong man in the capital speaks a different language to you,
Yeah.
doesn't have the same morals to you as you do and how your community does. And suddenly accountability is no longer there. The greatest resource suddenly becomes power, because these huge countries have huge resources at their disposal. And so there is this constant sudden fight for power because there isn't a national identity. The colonialists ensured that it wasn't easy for people to feel a common bond of community with people who lived, thousands of miles away, in some cases, hundreds of miles away, and didn't share, any histories or traditions with each other. And so when power becomes the most important commodity, then begins this sudden fight for power, something that wasn't, the people had not previously been used to. But that was the reality that was installed through the divide and rule policy. It made conflict a defining factor to ensure that you and your own community were not left behind. And that was the unfortunate reality, and that's what we saw quickly after independence.
Mm-hmm.
That sense of common identity really wasn't there. So we had many of the individuals who eventually fought for independence, who are far more suited to the battlefield than they were to a state house. They were suddenly at the top of their countries, and they were the ones who were first given the task of building these new nations. And so, as you can imagine, that really isn't an easy place to start from,
Yeah.
without a common sense of identity and a common bond. And so you had these constant tuggles for power. But since the independence era of the 1960s, a lot of that has subsided. Less than 10% of the continent is currently under authoritarian rule. People have, in a very short period of time, as I said, within my parents' lifetime, less than that, in fact, have tried their hardest to say, look, we should move forward. We're going to move forward as a country together. What are the best systems of democracy for us? And that's a conversation that these countries will continue to have, well into the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. The other thing about that is how we have this unrealistic expectation for Africa to perform at a much higher rate and a much higher level than other countries. All while globally the expectation is that whatever pains or sufferings that Africa or Africans and its respective diasporans suffer, that those are not of as much import. For example, in the book, when you talk about how King Leopold effectively built and sustained a machine that resulted in the genocide of 10 million people in the DRC. And we never talk about that in the public space, not even in Africa. I didn't even learn that when I was in school. And yeah, I know I said there was, and I know I kind of alluded that I was old, but I'm not that old. And I think that by the time I was in school, this is a conversation that should have been had. That these are the things that actually happened. It wasn't that there was just colonization, but there were entire ethnic groups, like in Namibia, that were completely eliminated.
Yeah.
And so now we have these huge gaps in our psyche, in our social understanding. But I'd like to step a little closer to the question of identity as we're seen as Africans. And let's talk about Ian Smith and Zimbabwe.
Mhm.
There's a significant amount of inhumane and some ugliness that is in that space, because he was very adamant about the supremacy of whiteness in Zimbabwe. And he did not shy away from it, and he was even willing to forego any linkages that he may have had in order to establish that. Talk to us about that.
Ian Smith's regime was probably, one of the most brutal white supremacist regimes, the world has ever known. As I mentioned in the book, it was his government that inspired, white supremacists in America during the 60s and 70s who looked at the depth that Ian Smith was willing to go to maintain white rule over Zimbabwe, what was then called Rhodesia. And white supremacists in America were really taken by as they saw it, what an incredible idol that he was, to the point where as I mentioned in the book, Dylan Roof dedicated the Dylan Roof, who murdered churchgoers in black churchgoers in the U.S.
In Charleston, South
In Charleston,
Carolina.
in Charleston, South Carolina. He dedicated his manifesto and his website to Ian Smith, calling himself the last Rhodesian. And so that was the struggle that black Zimbabweans had to fight back against. A man who time and time again repeated the slogan that the white man will forever rule Zimbabwe. And it is within that context that you had these freedom fighters who emerged, who spent a really, really long time while other African countries were enjoying independence. Ian Smith's grip remained strong on Zimbabwe well into the 70s and into the 80s. And the length of that struggle and that battle created many of the freedom fighters that we know of today, including Robert Mugabe. And what that led to was this desire amongst Mugabe to seek revenge over the white population in Zimbabwe. And so, I mean, giving that context doesn't, it's no way trying to justify his actions when he became president, but it's just to give the background and the history, and so people understand, how countries ended up in the situation that they are in today. Why would someone do the things that Mugabe did while he was in office? You start to see, what sort of environment created that level of anger, and that he felt the need to seek such revenge in the way he did. And it paints a picture, of the struggles that many African countries took against white supremacy at its heart, to build their nations. And when you have someone like Ian Smith, who who was a proud white supremacist, when you're fighting against that, you start to understand, some of the challenges that existed when a country like Zimbabwe finally got independence, and those who had suffered under white supremacy for so long, chose to seek vengeance, unfortunately, because in many ways they had been themselves radicalized by the white supremacy that they'd had to live through.
Absolutely, yes. And then you think about just the different follow-on experiences of different countries in Africa, as we have continued to grow post-independence. And, issues such as the question of multi-party elections or having multi-party governments, or even the idea that women can be in offices of president or vice president or deputy president, prime minister at that. And how those kinds of things have sort of been portrayed as the last stand for the former Africa big man. And this leads me to my next question, which is, because you are editor advised, I'm quite certain that you do come across very interesting colorings, I'll call them, or truths that are painted about not just Africa as a whole, or even Nigeria or individual countries, but also just of how you should carry yourself. How do you navigate that?
I mean, it's really important for me whenever I, look to cover a story from the region, to ensure that I include the context that I was talking about, that there's some background to that conversation. One of the things that we see most often in media reports about the continent is that they choose, when they're talking about an issue that might be happening in a specific country, to label it as an Africa problem. To say that, this is a challenge faced by Africa, when in fact
Mhm.
perhaps they're only talking about two, maybe even one, two countries. And there's this desire to put Africa in the headline, and to constantly push an idea of this monolith of predetermined destinies and realities. And so for me, it's important that advice, I speak to other editors who are considering either writing or commissioning stories about content, say to them that think about how you would report the same story when talking about a European country or a North American country or an Asian country. It's really key that we don't allow stigma and discrimination to color the way we look at stories about African countries. The region, like anywhere else, is a region of anything and everything. It contains multitudes of experiences. Some are stories of great joy, and others are stories of tragedy, like anywhere else in the world. And so for me, it's really important that when I think about telling stories, I try and bring the story down to its essential parts. And often, when talking about these stories, it's about people and individuals and
Mhm.
specific communities. And it's really important that we give people the platform to tell the stories of their culture and their country, and not flatten their identities as if they don't have a specific identity of their own.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. It's I find it interesting, when you say that, because we often have this thing in social media, just regular conversation, where somebody throws an African proverb in the
Yeah,
mix, like
yeah,
this, and in your book you sort of you unwrap it and say, look, just take a very profound statement, add a couple of things here, and
yeah.
maybe a
Mhm.
tree or an animal, and you're good.
And you're good,
Like
yeah.
what one of my newest ones that's become a favorite is, when you eat with the devil, be sure to use a long spoon.
Mm.
what
I feel
what are your favorite ones, or some of your favorite ones, now that we're talking about African sayings?
African sayings. That's a very good one. Well, probably my favorite one is the jollof rice at the top of the cooler was once at the bottom of the pot. And so it's like a reminder that in life, like, you can either be on the top or the bottom. Like, you never know what the future holds. Um,
I'm
that
sorry,
one gets
say that again.
the jollof rice at the top of the cooler. So jollof rice at the top of the cooler was once at the bottom of the pot.
Aha.
So yes, so yeah, that is that is one that I hear quite often. But yeah, no, it's one of those things where it's such a shame that different countries don't get to take credit for certain proverbs. We just hear this is an African proverb thrown around.
Yeah, and to that, at, as we're unpacking that, I often ask myself, okay, when we look at current situations, we see a lot of the world to Africa, aid to Africa, education to Africa, technology to Africa. What do you see as what Africa has brought to the world? And I really don't want to call it a contribution, because in some cases we've had significant impact.
We've had impact in every single major industry in the world, from business to tech to music and film. In the book I talk about how African foodways from West Africa, slaves from West Africa, basically created a lot of what we see today as the culture of Southern America, that Southern hospitality. For a while, it was rice brought over by slaves that was the single greatest economic value of Southern America. And we see that impact throughout the world, from from people who have built their lives from the continent and abroad. And so when this book is not just a history of Africa for Africans. It's a history of the world. It's a history. It's British history. It's American history. It because of the impact and the contributions that the continent's had throughout the world. Everyone should truly make the effort to understand the richness of this region, the specificities, the identities, how these countries came about. And also why it's so damaging that we continue to push these negative stereotypes of the region without fully appreciating the depth of value. And the reason why a lot of people don't fully appreciate the contributions that have been made by uh, Africans across the region is because our individual identities are never really fully appreciated. And that's something that, it's a long time ago, that should have changed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. It's now time for us to go ahead and see what our audience has asked, any questions that have been asked by the audience. Thank you so much. Erin Relford asks, as Dipo talks about the carving out of Africa and the mention of different worship practices, writers, and artists, Africa is such a rich land of resources. And to that, I would add a rich land of expression, as what we now see in a lot of the music videos coming out of Africa, which have been a way for us to actually tell our story differently. Add to that spiritual practices, like Erin has mentioned. Where can one find more African writers or content that you would recommend? And I really want to hear this one, because I know that as an editor, and especially with the research you had to do for this book, you did some very deep digging.
Yeah, I mean, there are storytellers. The continent has a rich history of storytellers, and you can find these stories everywhere in music, in film, in books. So I was inspired by so many of the Afrobeats artists who are out today, writers like Binyavanga Wainaina, Chinua Achebe, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I could just keep going on and just listing names. I mean, where there are just so many wonderful writers. I know in the US there are lots of really, really great, Black-owned publications that try and connect the diaspora together. I believe kind of OK Africa is one. There's a really great podcast called It's a Continent that looks into the history of different African countries. There are just so many ways of accessing so much rich content about the region that I'd always recommend people kind of really, really searching far and wide.
Thanks. While we're on that topic, I'd like to understand, how much difficulty did you have in your research? And I ask because I know that records that were kept by the colonial governments were actually sealed for a long time. And I know that because records of what happened in Kenya were kept hidden and you couldn't access them at all. And we've recently had a gentleman who has become somewhat of a historian in our community, who tells us about the challenges he has just being able to get that access, to see what the documents looked like, what was being said, what was being written, what was being recorded, so that we can now recreate the understanding of who we were based on how we see ourselves. What was that like for you?
I mean, it was a real challenge. You mentioned that in schools across the region, a lot of this history isn't even taught in African countries. And part of the reason is because many of the key players, the founding fathers, are still alive. And in some, countries like Nigeria, many of them are still very influential. And so, a lot of that history still is very new and very raw and very fresh. But there, with time and, I took a good amount of time put this book together. I was able through lots of different resources to try and collate a story that I believe really tells kind of a real sort of comprehensive tale of or paints a portrait of modern Africa. And that's something that it's a challenge because unfortunately it's not really something that's been done before in one place. And so hopefully my book will make it easier for others who are really interested in the continent and in the history of the Black diaspora and many of the traditions, food, fashion, music, technology traditions that Black Africans on the continent and across the diaspora have contributed to the world.
Absolutely. That is the thing that I enjoyed the most about your book. Because like I mentioned earlier, by training, I'm a political scientist. So for me, these are conversations that happen with lots of big words,
Yeah.
But and those books are hard to read.
Mm-hmm.
And they become a turnoff. And I think in that way, we've sort of been unable to proceed with the question of to understand ourselves. But your book is so accessible. It's such an easy read. And it has so many chuckles and it paints so many, images in the mind, like with the young man who is in the video, who has a fly on his face, and the narrator looks at him and says, we can save him by just $1 a day.
Yeah.
And I think all of us who have seen a commercial about helping Africa know exactly which commercial you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I imagine kind of in your work as well, it's been difficult to kind of get a lot of that information into a lot of the information that really feeds and that gives us a sense of how the history and the modern how modern Africa was really built. And so hopefully, and I wanted this to be accessible. I didn't want it to be a textbook because I want it to be as easy as possible for people to not only read it, but to feel a personal connection, with the region.
Thank you. We have a question from Sophia, who first thanks you for joining us today. Excited to read your book. What is something you would have liked to include or to have included in your book, but it didn't make the cut? Yeah, spill the tea. This is the part we really want.
I had a wonderfully supportive group of editors and a brilliant publisher here in the UK as well in the US. So I was really fortunate that I think everything that I wanted to include, the essential things were all made the cut. I can talk about Nigeria for days and days and days. So I had to ensure that I didn't write too much about Lagos and my own family. But I was really fortunate that the essential topics that I wanted to cover made the cut. There is a tiny section on football that initially was a lot longer than what made the cut, the final cut. So when you get to that, or if you get to that, it was a little bit longer, but that's part of the chapter on rivalries and identity building that has come through food and culture. But I was fortunate that all the essentials are here in the book.
There's a part that I suspect that was deeply edited, and correct me if I'm wrong. This is the story of how you took your dog to the vet, and then the vet tried to give you someone else's dog. And in my mind, I could see that conversation. Oh, Gao, here's your dog. No, it's not my dog. That's not,
Yeah. No, it was a far longer conversation with the vet who was trying to give some context. It's trying to illustrate how everything in Lagos is negotiable, and people believe it's negotiable. So when the vets temporarily lost our dog, they simply just effectively handed us another dog and thought that we could negotiate our way through this issue, but we insisted that they keep looking for our dog until they found him. But yes,
When they find, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh no, that's it. Yeah, it was some back and forth with them, confused as to why we wouldn't take this deal that they'd offered us.
When they found your dog, how did they explain to you what happened? Like, did it just wander out of the office, or?
There was never really a full explanation. It's kind of like, here you go, let's not discuss this anymore. Our dog arrived back, and they said, I think they tried to blame the dog and say that he went hiding where he shouldn't have been or something. But yes, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for that. That was a good one. I remember reading that part and just bursting out laughing. And I think I laughed for a good 20 minutes because I could see this whole sequence in my head of how this conversation went, so on and so forth. We have one last question. How do you think we can accelerate the education of Africans to our history so we can be more aware and proud of our heritage?
I mean, that's a really, really important question, and it's kind of the essential, the essential importance of my work. Of course, the first thing I'll suggest is to buy the book, "Africa's Not a Country." But I hope we consider teaching a lot more of this in schools. We can, people across the diaspora, should try and enrich their knowledge of the history and the present of the continent, to explore, to explore the continent more, to try and build real personal connections. As I mentioned, I'm so proud of all the incredible work that Afrobeat artists in Hollywood are doing, to really tell the stories of their countries to the wider world. I think it's also important that on top of that, we build really deep, people across diaspora build really deep connections to the homeland as well. But the most important thing to do is just to keep reading, to have these conversations with our grandparents and our parents, and to make sure that we have these conversations with our kids as well, so that we start to have a better understanding of where we've come from, so that that can help guide us towards the future. As I said, we've made huge progress in such a short period of time, and I feel confident based on some of the incredible work that young activists are doing throughout the region, in issues of gender-based violence and police brutality and climate change, and that work will be enriched if we have a strong understanding of the mistakes of our predecessors, and also the good things that they did, and we have that understanding, and also those across the diaspora who are interested in making contributions as well, they can better do so if they have a strong understanding of the history of the continent. And so it's work that we all need to do, and I hope that people will do some of that work through buying and reading this book.
Absolutely, yes. The book, like I said earlier, your book is fantastic. It takes some of the really heavy issues and discusses them in a way that just a regular person can read and say, okay, and pursue. And if there's a thread in there that maybe they want to pursue further, it's a good starting point to say, okay, so this is what happened. This is why there has been this ongoing oil spill in West Africa that nobody really talks about, but it's actually caused significant health challenges, and who has reported that. Whereas if that same event happens elsewhere, everybody wants to talk about it. It is 24-hour news, so on and so forth. So since we are at Google, I have to ask, as we're winding down, what is your favorite Google product that you just cannot live without?
That's a very very good question. I mean, just the rise of my email communications has gone up a lot in the last few months, and it is by far, Gmail is by far the cleanest of the email providers. So Right now, I'd say I pretty much struggle to function without Gmail. But just OG Google is still like an incredibly wonderful product. I still find it, I'd probably say, I'm a very curious mind, so I spend a long time just giving the information. That's I don't know how people wrote books like this before the internet.
Yes.
It's an absolute miracle. So yeah, I'd certainly say that was a key part of getting the resources of this book put together.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll be sure to let my friends in Gmail know that
Yeah,
they've
please
definitely
do.
made.
My
Will
life a
do
lot
so.
easier. Yeah.
But I agree with you. I used to work with a gentleman who wrote his PhD thesis maybe 50 years ago, and he wrote 500 pages by hand.
Oh wow.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
I
technology
don't
has
even.
really.
I could not do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So some rapid fire questions for fun, so we can exhale here.
Great.
All right. Amapiano or Afrobeat?
Afrobeats. Good start. Yeah.
We
Amapiano is making huge progress. But Afrobeats is still the king and queen sound of the region.
Okay. All right. Hollywood or Nollywood?
Like Nollywood's in my heart. Maybe if the films were less than 5 hours long each, then I would more easily say Nollywood.
But
But
no,
I
but surely
you know
Dipo, you understand, we're Africans. We have to tell the story
you have to tell it
from.
fully from
Yeah.
beginning to the half of the beginning to three quarters of the beginning to take a break. Yeah, I do. It is a very, very special thing that should just be a few hours shorter.
I know. I know exactly what you mean. All right. What's your favorite African food? And please don't say jollof, please.
No, probably my favorite meal is eba, and it's a Nigerian spinach stew. And eba is cassava that's ground and mixed with hot water, and it's soft and it's my comfort go to. Jollof rice is just for Sundays, and like celebrations. But like eba that's everyday business.
Fantastic. Well, we have come to the end. Dipo, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We certainly do appreciate it. I've really enjoyed the talk, and I've really enjoyed the book. Any last words for us before we wrap up?
Just to say thank you all so much. I understand that there are people watching from many different countries. So just to say thank you all so much. And Africa's Not a Country is out now in the UK and throughout Europe, and it's out on September the 6th in the US. So looking forward to as many people as possible, hopefully here, buying it and having a read of the book.
Absolutely, absolutely agree. So, family, thank you so much for joining us. We certainly do appreciate your time, and have a happy Africa Day.